Let us now move on to session 2.1, an introduction to public-private partnerships. First, a few words about the history of public-private partnerships, the more recent history. In ancient history, public-private partnerships were used by the ancient Romans, in the late 18th century by the government of France to secure the participation of private shipbuilders to extend the reach of the government's merchant marine. More recently and more relevant to our discussion is the recent interest that has been developed in the use of public-private partnerships as ways of extending the ability of government to provide public services. Recently in the United Kingdom, 11% of public spending has been undertaken through public-private partnerships, mostly in the areas of education and health. This has saved the government considerable money, while at the same time delivering better services. Now that is a very attractive combination. On the one hand, you can enhance service delivery, which is the ultimate objective of government. On the second hand, you're going to do it with somebody else's money. Where's the catch? Well, you have to pay the private sector partner who's going to deliver ultimately the service, but you can delay payment over time, or you can in fact eliminate payment and allow for the operator of the service to charge the users of the service a certain fee in order to recoup the cost of the original investment and of ongoing operation of the service. Some of the benefits: public-private partnerships increase the spending capacity of government. Risks are transferred in whole or in part to the private sector when it comes time to do the implementation. And for the public sector, there's an increased value for money is achieved through this relationship with the private sector. And that is not just by the fact that the private sector may fund, but that the private sector itself may bring innovative ideas and new efficiencies in the management and operation of the public sector service in question. What drives public-private partnerships? Again, let's look at the example from the UK. In 1992, there was a recession, different from the recession we know today in the sense that there was not a financial crisis that underpinned the recession. In the 1992 recession, the government was suffering from an economic slowdown. The economy was suffering from an economic slowdown. There was a problem of infrastructure, there was no public money, and the government was certainly not willing to raise taxes, which would have been incredibly unpopular. In order to secure the needed massive investment in public infrastructure and stimulate the economy, the private sector or the public sector went to the private sector and negotiated public-private partnerships. These public-private partnerships today have been worth over 60 billion euros, and there have been over 620 private-public partnership projects that have taken place since 1992. 450 of those projects as of about a year ago were operational, and as I said previously, over 11% of all of the government of the UK projects are implemented through public-private partnerships. This is a significant amount, but the benefits have also been significant to all parties concerned and ultimately to the consumer, to the citizen, him or herself. Initially, these projects were mostly in the area of infrastructure. The government would get the private sector to finance or build hospitals, schools, prisons in some cases, water facilities, water treatment facilities, and so on. The public sector would ultimately either buy it back or lease it back, or it would fall back to the government after a certain number of years. The number of years usually determined by the time it would have taken the private sector entity to recoup its investment and profit. Involving the private sector has certain advantages. One is called whole life costing. This is a method of evaluating and comparing building materials and components by looking at the costs, the lifespans, the running and maintenance costs. In other words, you look at the whole value of the proposition as opposed to breaking it down into individual components. The private sector brings innovation, different types of management skills that would otherwise not be necessarily available in the public domain, or in the public sector, that is. Risks are transferred, as we've already mentioned. And design, build, and operate synergies can lead to several benefits. and alternative values or uses of the service in question may be derived largely as a result of the entrepreneurial interests of the private sector partner, who will be seeking other ways in which to generate revenue, income, and value, not only for his company, but also for the consumer and for government. So these are very significant benefits. What are the requirements and success factors for PPPs? Good public sector or private sector management skills as well as finance. In other words, your counterpart's got to be competent from a managerial and technical perspective and have the financing that's required to move ahead with the project. The other requirement would be innovation in the delivery and commercial freedoms to deliver efficiency. In other words, the private sector partner must have the ability to innovate in the delivery of the services. In other words, the contract from the public service entity must not be so constraining that it limits the ability of the private sector partner to innovate in delivering the service using new approaches, new technologies, new management practices. This will allow it to, again, as we put it here, deliver efficiencies that would not otherwise have been evident. So there has to be room for the private sector partner to act in an innovative fashion. In turn, the key successes to public-private partnerships, to success of these partnerships are the following. You need a very robust contract. The contract's got to be well-defined, highly specified. The risks need to be transferred along with the incentives. They have to be identified. There has to be a termination provision. At one point, either the project terminates and the ownership reverts back to the public sector, or it continues under specific terms and conditions. All of these have to be clearly defined and written down in the contract. Another concern, of course, is that and this relates to the whole life costing, idea of whole life costing. The success of the project should be determined not so much in terms of given outputs, but in terms of outcomes. In other words, we might look to improve the delivery of let's say, a public transport system. The outcome will be not so much in the number of buses we might make available. It will be in terms of the service that is delivered to the end user of the transportation system. The same would apply, of course, to an ICT project, where we'd be looking at, for example, in a data center, that we want a certain level of throughput. We're not concerned about the number of CPUs, the number of servers. We want this level of throughput. We want this guarantee of mean time between failures of 99.99%, whatever it may be. So that's how we would specify the delivery of services in a PPP type of contract. We don't focus on numbers. We focus on levels of service over time. What is a PPP and what are the definitions that are accepted in the marketplace at present? There are different definitions, and two of them that we believe are particularly relevant are the following. The first one from the Canadian Council of Public-Private Partnerships. A PPP is a cooperative venture between the public and private sectors, built on the expertise of each partner, that best meets the clearly defined public needs through an appropriate allocation of resources, risks, and rewards. Again, all of these elements have to be clearly recognized and dealt with in the contract that binds the public and private sector partners in a PPP arrangement. The World Bank Toolkit for Public-Private Partnerships in Highways defines PPPs as follows. A PPP constitutes a sustained collaborative effort between the public sector and the private enterprise to achieve a common objective, i.e., let's say a road project, a server center, a specific public service that is going to be delivered, while they pursue their own individual interests. This is a more general definition, but it certainly raises the issues that need to be taken into consideration. Private sector is interested in profit, public sector is interested in service. We have to make sure that both of those concerns are adequately dealt with in the contract to deliver a particular service using a public-private partnership. Some examples of PPPs include, for example, in the area of economic infrastructure, water and sewerage treatment plants, incineration plants, expressways and toll roads, power and gas plant systems. In social infrastructure, the following would apply: education facilities, hospitals, accommodation for government ministries, equipment, the building of government buildings themselves, sports facilities, major infrastructure, IT infrastructure work such as a major broadband or fiber network ring or fiber network extension from one city to another. Those are major IT infrastructure projects that are prime candidates for ICT type or PPP type of funding. Let us look now at the various types of PPPs and how they are used in the education, health, water, and sanitation sector. This slide is projected for you to reflect on how this might apply to the ICT sector. Now, we haven't found a similar side in the ICT sector, largely because PPPs in ICT4D are still new. And we'll explain why that is the case in the coming slides. But for the purpose of discussion, let us look at the types of PPPs on the left-hand side and the primary purpose of the PPP at the top. All of these PPPs involve concessions. The role of the private sector is clearly defined here. The primary purpose of the PPP, reforming and the regulatory framework. That is a policy responsibility of government. It's highly unlikely that government will contract out through a PPP or otherwise the development of public policy. On the other hand, government will want to consult with the private sector on the development of certain types of projects. And again, these complicated projects that are associated with multi-stakeholder PPP partnerships, the private sector and the public sector will want to come together to discuss policy related to implementation and regulation. Otherwise, the main area of interaction between the purpose of the PPP and the type of PPP will be in the areas of research and development, design and construction, service delivery, institutional and human capacity building, much lesser extent again in terms of oversight and performance. Key areas of focus will be design and construction, service delivery, institutional and human capacity building, with some possibilities in research and product development. So risks, some important points about PPPs, and these are the risks associated with them. Some PPPs, being concessions to the private sector, are an exchange between the public and private sectors where one assumes the risks such as financing, that is a private sector partner, such as financing, operations, and delivering outputs and outcomes. In a PPP, the contract that is established is, as I mentioned previously, focused not so much on outputs, but more on outcomes. Some of these outcomes are measured in terms of quality of service. For example, as I mentioned previously, the mean time between failure for servers or PCs, levels of service in terms of number of clients served at a given level of satisfaction over time, and based on other predefined indicators of performance. Again, in order to agree on these delivery outcomes, one has to have done the analysis and have considered in more detail what is sought as an outcome from a public-private partnership. The concessions that are part and parcel of a public-private partnership are exclusive, usually, to the private sector partners for a given public service under conditions of market power. And this is done in exchange for the private sector partners assuming risk. What does market power mean? It means virtual monopoly in some cases. The more a firm has market power, the stronger it has a position in the market and the greater it has an ability to control the direction of that market. The public sector is usually the only provider of certain types of public services and as such has market power. The problem is, of course, that in the public sector there is no competition except when you want to involve a private sector partner. The private sector partner's interests will be in part derived from the fact that he or she sees the opportunity of making money from offering a service that nobody else does offer. That means that the service provider has significant market power. Concessions can also be tendered using open tender process. In fact, they usually are tendered using open tender processes according to best practices in public procurement. Let us look now at the various types of concessions that can be put in place under a public-private partnership. First of all, what is a concession? It's any type of an arrangement in which the government, in this case, assigns the right to a private investor to provide a particular public service under conditions, again, of this significant market power. So what types are there, general types are there, of public-private partnerships? One is known as the build, own, operate contract, which does exactly as it says. You build, you own, you operate the service and the infrastructure that goes with it. You build, operate, and transfer the service. Another a certain amount of time lapses after you've built, you've operated the service. It falls back into the hands of government, which assumes ownership of the service from that point onward. Management and service contracts, where the concession is strictly for that purpose, and leases, where again the concession is for a lease. The following slide looks at the continuum of public-private partnerships. The more you move to the right, the greater the role of the private sector, and also the greater the communication between public and private sector entities must be to achieve a particular level of partnership. Let's look at the slide at the left side. That's works and service contracts. That's basically outsourcing. The government is the contract overseer and implementer, although it may well actually overseer, but the private sector may be implementing and reporting back, to the public sector contractor. We have management and maintenance contracts, operations and maintenance concessions, and build, operate, transfer concessions of various types. Full privatization may exist under some circumstances where the government decides that it wants the private sector to operate, let's say, a public service. An example could be an airport that is run strictly as a fully private concession that is not owned by the public sector, but which has to operate under certain guidelines from the Ministry of Transportation in the delivery of various public services in the area of transportation, and in particular in meeting certain safety and operational safety guidelines associated with the airline transport. In exchange of the fully privatized airport, for example, then of course the private sector consortium can charge very significant rates, both to the consumers who transit the airport, as well as the airlines that have the rights to land and use the facilities of the airport. Definition and types of greenfield concessions. What is a greenfield concession? This is a new opportunity to do work that hasn't been done previously. In the area of PPPs, that's when, for example, government says we will provide you with a concession. It might be considered a greenfield concession. Operating concessions. Government retains the ownership of the public assets used in the delivery of operations. So the private sector contractor may well be contracted to actually build and put in place the elements that underpin the service, but government retains ownership of the assets and of the services. That is really more of a contract. And the concession really is during the period of construction and operationalizing the public asset before it's actually handed over. Investment concessions, the concessionaire undertakes the responsibility for funding as well as operating. And the operating concession could be that the private sector has the responsibility for providing the funding. Everything else remains in the hands of the public sector entity. In investment concessions, a concessionaire undertakes, as I said, the responsibility for funding as well as operating. The concessionaire has obligations that are agreed upon in the contract, which is known as a concession agreement. The obligations are defined both in cash amounts and in volume terms. For instance, obligations to provide services to a defined number of new consumers under given circumstances. There are obligations related to the operations including, again, performance standards. We talked about performance standards. In other words, you operate and deliver the service at a given level of performance in terms of number of people served over a given amount of time. A satisfaction rate in terms of the delivery of that service would be established as well. Other types of PPP arrangements: work for services contracts, management and maintenance contracts, operation and maintenance concessions, and the following, which we'll describe in further detail: BOT, which is build, own, operate, transfer. Build, operate, transfer, that is. Build, own, operate for BOO, and build, own, operate, and transfer for BOOT. BOO, private sector investor finances a public sector asset. The private sector investor contracts for the construction and subsequent operation. Private investor owns the asset throughout its life, and revenues from fees, rentals, or services charged for which he recovers his investment and costs. So in other words, the private sector enterprise recovers a whole series of fees and costs associated with the concession. There's a finite contract term, at which point the service and or the infrastructure associated with it may revert back to the government, or the service may be retendered for to another operator or to another tender exercise. Contract validity invariably in many of these PPPs is based on performance. In other words, if their performance levels are not met in terms of the service level agreements, the quality of service, mean time between failure, and so on, there are usually terms in the contract which allow for the government to reclaim ownership of the operation and to either continue the operation and or to go to tender for a new operator to complete the work to be done, if that's the case. Build, own, transfer. Again, similar to the previous case of the BOO, but at termination of the concession, the ownership of the asset is transferred to the government. The investment and operating costs are recouped again through user charges, and usually the time needed to do so is typically the key factor in determining the point at which the asset is transferred. So it's built, ownership takes place, the operator recoups his investment, as well as the cost of operations plus profits. Once that is well established, the private sector operator is happy, and the entity, the project, the service can be transferred to the government, which maintains ownership and or can continue to, through another tender, to have it operated by a private sector entity. There's various variations on these concession agreements. Design build or design transfer, design build maintain, and so on. So design build would be where the private sector operator or partner has the sole responsibility for designing and building according to the specifications. When it's built, it's the public sector partner that takes care of the running and operation of the infrastructure and services. There's a whole series of these which you can look at your leisure, which indicate the extensive nature of these types of concessions. Bearing in mind that many of these public-private partnership type concessions have been used extensively in public sector, largely for infrastructure build projects, such as the ones I mentioned previously: building government buildings, hospitals, prisons, water treatment plants, and so on. Their application in the area of ICT still is in the process of being decided, and the relationship between public-private partnerships and ICT is still a growing one, and by and large, most of the public-private partnerships in the ICT sector are focused on infrastructure, but there are some examples from the service sector which we'll look at. So what are the advantages of public-private partnerships to the public sector? So first of all, increasing efficiency in the execution of projects. Private sector is under a tight deadline, under serious constraints, doesn't do the job on time and on specification. The private sector partner loses money. That's a very strong incentive for performance. It's a route to increase investment in public assets without increasing the fiscal burden of the Treasury and of the taxpayer. It improves budgetary certainty in the sense that there's no longer any question of how the funds will be used, over what period of time, and if there are any delays, the delays are not the responsibility of the public entity, but of the private sector entity. They don't come on to the books. Whole life costing, in other words, we're looking at the cost of the project over its whole term, and life cycle analysis might be applicable. In other words, we look at the cost of building, operating a public entity service or facility or infrastructure over a given period of time, and we may well look at it over the whole life of the project, so that it's possible to get a much better idea of the true cost of the enterprise that we want to put in place to enhance service delivery to the public. More achievement of value for money, again, improved efficiency for the reasons I mentioned. Economic diversification, you get different public sector or private sector partners to come into play. It helps them to secure more work and to develop their expertise and their competitiveness. It contributes to growth. You can define the outputs and requirements in terms of service outputs and performance standards, as I mentioned before. Those are advantageous because it's no longer a question of saying, well, we want you to build a server room with 32 servers running Microsoft Windows 2000, et cetera, et cetera. So we can specify we want this level of throughput for these types of services over time at this level of quality. Advantages to the public sector, again, the risk is transferred to the party best able to manage them. In this case, the private sector partner. That's risks associated with construction, implementation, integration, operations. The public sector is less exposed to the risks of construction, implementation, integration, and operations. More capacity to implement, more access to financial resources. Public funds can be used otherwise. There's a whole series of synergies that come into play between the public-private sector, and alternative uses can also be unlocked by the private sector partner in consultation with the public sector partner. What are the advantages to the public sector? Well, let's look at both scenarios. In the first instance, the public finance project and the private finance project. The cost to the community is, in the public finance project, mostly borne up front in the form of a public investment which costs the Treasury money and which have an indirect impact on taxation. On the other hand, the privately financed project has a small, or in some cases non-existent, public investment, and the benefits are shared by the community, and there are some costs that are spread over a long period of time to the community in terms of user charges of one form or another. For the private sector, new markets and opportunities are made available through public-private partnerships. The private sector considers the government as, generally speaking, a reliable partner, one that pays in full and on time. That's a major consideration. There's a contractual certainty with government. Usually government contracts are adhered to. And there's a high degree of predictability in cash flow. In other words, as I said, we're going to get paid on time because it's government. What are some of the concerns in adopting a public-private partnership approach? The PPP models can be restrictive. Once they're signed, it's difficult to go back and change things. PPP models or PPP agreements are structured around attaining certainty of what is required, and clear demarcations of risk are transferred, risk transfer and responsibility. They're usually suited to long-term, high-value projects. It's very difficult to change contracts, and the provider is in a relative position of relative power. That's the public sector provider. Some ICT projects are not suited to public-private partnerships, partially because of fast-changing technology. In some cases, that might be an advantage. In some cases, it's a disadvantage. There may be unclear solution or unclear boundaries because of the complexity of the solutions and processes in question. For example, automation of the health services may require analysis of a whole series of very complex human processes and workflow that is difficult to account for and to quantify in terms of level of effort and cost. Significant development work may be required, and that again is difficult to measure. There are intangible assets that are that need to be taken into consideration, not the least of which is intellectual property. And there's high risk associated with the implementation of ICT projects, especially those projects that require coding and that are projects that are proposed to automate processes anew for the first time. Very high risk is associated with such endeavors. What is the legal basis for undertaking a public-private partnership? A legal basis in law, in the law of the land in question. Generally, public-private partnerships are considered contractual arrangements. Usually, the existing regulatory regime may apply. The Power Sector Telecoms and Competition Act usually would specify how contracts take place, the power sector and telecom sector being big sectors. It is likely and possible that the legal basis can be explained in these sectors. The Competition Act should also make it clear. Procurement through a PPP should be consistent with the government's existing procurement policies and the Procurement Act under the law and the guidelines of the entity responsible for public procurement, which invariably is the Ministry of Finance. The first question you need to ask before considering undertaking a PPP in your jurisdiction is whether or not it is allowed under the law to do the following. Can a state entity create, operate, and maintain ICT products through non-government entities on a contractual basis? In other words, deliver an ICT-enabled service through a non-government entity, in other words, a private sector partner, on a contract basis. Can the state assign duties that usually reside with state executive bodies to other organizations such as a private sector partner? In experience that we've had in Mongolia, where we undertook this assessment a couple of years back, an organization financed for implementation of specific functions at a state executive body shall execute government decisions and be responsible to the relevant minister. In other words, the legal text allows for PPPs to take place in the Mongolia context as long as the specific functions are clearly demarcated and there is a responsibility that is clearly assigned to the relevant minister of the government of Mongolia. Another concern in regards to implementing PPP projects dealing with ICT and e-government in general from the legal perspective is whether or not the law allows e-government or e-commerce activities, such as the provision of e-contracts, e-transactions, digital signatures, and whether in fact the law is e-neutral. This may not be the case or a requirement for all types of ICT projects. Certainly if you're setting up an ICT a project to undertake and build a fiber optic cable, e-compliance is not going to be a major consideration. But if, on the other hand, your project seeks to deliver an e-procurement service or an e-custom service, then you'll have to make sure that before that project can be implemented in general, and especially if it's going to be implemented as a PPP, whether or not the law allows for contracts, e-contracts, e-transactions, digital signatures, and so on. The other question to ask is, can the services be provided by the government PPP service provider electronically? That's a major consideration. Again, we're looking at e-government services in particular, apart from the ICT infrastructure projects. And are there restrictions on commercializing an e-government services or an ICT4D services using a PPP type of model? You must also look at the issue of licensing. If a private sector partner is going to be delivering a service using the PPP model, does it have to be licensed, and is there a regulatory regime that's associated with the licensing? We've already talked about e-payments, but that might be a consideration for certain types of PPPs in the ICT4D realm. You must also be concerned about the level of regulation and the flexibility the private sector partner will have to innovate in delivering a particular ICT service using a PPP ICT service in the public interest, that is. This table lists the preconditions for success of various types of PPPs on the left-hand side, and these considerations appear at the top of the columns appearing on the right of the at the top of the slide. So the various options include from service contracts to full privatization, the various issues of concern or preconditions of success for our stakeholder support, cost recovery, information about the system, and so on. The potential benefits of the option increase from low to high, but at the same time, the requirements to achieve the achieve these potential benefits increase under each one of the headings. Stakeholder support and political commitment have to be very high indeed when we move to a concession model. Cost recovering tariffs will have to be in place. There will be a requirement to share information and to have it open. A strong regulatory capacity will be required to ensure that the contract is implemented according to the rules and regulations of the land. And as a secondary consideration, country ratings are a useful precondition to a public-private partnership. High credit rating means that there's greater certainty in the eyes of a potential private sector partner that the money and other amenities will be respected. In other words, that the contractor will be paid on time and on specification. And that is what good country ratings are all about. Let us now look at undertaking some practical exercises under session 2.1 in the form of another group discussion. This time we break out into smaller groups of 4 to 8 people and discuss the following. What PPP projects have been undertaken in your jurisdiction? How many PPPs have been undertaken for e-government project implementation in particular? In your experience, what factors encourage and or limit public-private partnerships in your jurisdiction, and as they apply especially to e-government projects? Discuss these points and drop some recommendations. They will be very helpful in our further discussion and will help the instructor to better understand the issues and concerns you have, so that the instructor can customize the discussion to suit your specific concerns. Session 2.2, ICT and e-government projects. Let's look at the special case of e-government projects. We can look at alternate financial mechanisms and PPPs for a whole series of ICT projects. One area of particular concern will be the provision of e-government projects. Let us look at this in more detail. E-government has really two objectives. One is to enhance service delivery and increase process, and the second objective is to increase process efficiency by automating government processes. It assumes that there's a transformation in the way government works, and that transformation results in a change that now means that the public is now considered a client as opposed to an intrusion in the work of government officials. So e-government focuses on the public as a client. It requires the establishment of a service mentality because e-government is about service. It therefore requires public servants to adopt a service mentality in order to enhance service delivery. It usually requires re-engineering of government processes so that automation achieves economies of scale and rationalizes the way government works internally and interfaces with the public externally. And it may well require a change management process that goes beyond our discussion, but is certainly a part and parcel of an e-government strategy and its implementation. The current model of e-government focuses on service delivery with the public as client, as I just mentioned. The government needs to transform itself to meet the demands of the public, because the public is really not interested in what happens in government. The public is interested in service delivery. Business process efficiency through shared services is another component of the Accenture model of e-government. which looks at how to consolidate government services so that the greatest efficiency is achieved in the eyes of the public. The following slides looks at those processes or functions that occur in government that are susceptible to this shared service concept, and let us discuss those very briefly. On the left-hand side, we have different types of activities. Most of these different types of activities are transversal. In other words, they apply horizontally across different ministries. All ministries have an IT or finance, human resource activity associated with them. What shared services suggests is that we try to share the approach between government entities and the applications that will underpin these various service areas. The graph shows that in this particular survey, this is the results of a survey, in brownish violet on the right-hand side are a listing in priority of those services that are considered by chief information officers in different organizations in a variety of different countries as being most susceptible to a shared service approach. One is IT itself, that is networks, infrastructure, PCs, training, and so on. Finance, human resources, supply chain and purchasing, which is procurement, which could be considered and actually should be considered a shared service. Facilities and property management. You can manage schools, you can manage warehousing, government buildings. It's all the same it's the same general idea. Documents and records management, yes, legal departments have got specific requirements, but by and large, the rules of document management processing can be applied across the board as opposed to being developed ministry by ministry. Legal services also can be rationalized as a shared service, and what's known as customer interaction, customer service provision, again, is another area of shared service that can be considered. E-government and shared services in e-government focuses on using ICT to rationalize and consolidate the services under these headings so that they're available across the board to different ministries in the most efficient, cost-effective fashion possible. The question is, can they be rendered through the use of alternative financial mechanisms, not the least of which are PPPs? We'll discuss that. Shared services, various implementation models. As it stands out today, governments have developed e-services platforms using a variety of different funding models. Predominant among these is a traditional model, which is whereby government itself actually does the implementation. The second one is called co-sourcing. That is, government works with a strategic business partner. The strategic business partner may be involved in design as a subcontractor and in implementation as a subcontractor, but by and large it's still government that runs the show. Public-private joint venture, in which case it's similar to a PPP. It may be spun off as a PPP. Doesn't happen very often. There's a whole host of concerns that governments have about some of these shared services, not the least of which is the question of privacy of data and the security of data. And there's a combination of other sourcing arrangements that are described in the slide. What types of IT projects do we find in government? We've tried to categorize IT projects in e-government according to the following very general categories. In the first instance, IT infrastructure project, large infrastructure or equipment project, so building networks, telecoms infrastructure, a government fiber optic network, computerizing the Ministry of Labor and installing PCs and networks. Those are large infrastructure projects. IT services, in this case maintenance, training, support, services that are there to support the existence and operation of ICT infrastructure. Then there is the critical standalone software applications, which can range from very specific applications in a given sector to office productivity suites or complex systems like customer relationship management, resource management planning applications, and so on. These include, in the more complex software applications, enterprise resource planning, content management systems, customer relationship management, as explained in the slide under the heading of more complex software applications. Shared services would follow under the more complex software applications. Let's look at large infrastructure equipment projects, relatively easy to implement. Much experience has been acquired. It's a question of specifying what we want to do, how much quantity we want to use, and trenching, let's say in the case of digging and putting in place a marine or a fiber optic cable, or other physical work that needs to be undertaken. Large infrastructure does not usually include software development or application. It's just a question of engineering. So it's usually focused on the procurement of easily quantifiable materials and services, and as a result, it's simple to do, easy to measure, the risks are easy to quantify, therefore it is a prime candidate for a PPP type of arrangement. There are very serious benefits to looking at a PPP type of arrangement for creating a government infrastructure, such as, let's say, a fiber optic network. It can be a project that would run not just a fiber network that could be used by government, but alternative services could be spun off by such an investment so that the private sector itself could also participate in such a platform and use it as a basis for delivering a whole variety of different added services. So this is a very strong candidate for a PPP type of endeavor. Standalone software applications, again, one specific type of business process, whether financial, human resources, and so on. You can either design the system from bottom up by coding it, or you can buy it off the shelf. Given the extensive expertise that is that exists in the private sector in the form of software developers and management consulting firms, it's probably wiser to use an off-the-shelf application than to expose yourself to the considerable risk of undertaking first of all, coding the process or defining the processes you want to automate, and then coding and testing them. That's a very risky enterprise. The standalone application can involve many business units, ministries, or departments. The more different entities are involved, the greater the complexity, the greater the difficulty, the greater the risks during implementation. Standalone applications can be managed by one entity. That can be managed by one entity are easiest to manage and implement because you limit the human factor that can lead to all kinds of uncertainty and which is often difficult to quantify. Some applications are very specialized. There are few options and they are expensive to implement and operate, in which case they may or may not be candidates. They may be if there is a private sector partner that specializes in these types of applications and with which it might be easier to enter into a public-private partnership, or it might simply be a question of just outsourcing it as a regular contract. That would have to be determined. Applications that are unique to a sector may not require system-wide implementation. For example, in the Ministry of Education, you'll want to develop a database of students, but obviously that's not going to be relevant in other ministries. Another type of IT project in e-government is the integrated software application design. Vertical applications integrated into a whole, that is enterprise resource planning, content management systems. These are transversal applications. They can be very complicated if you develop them on your own. If you buy them off the shelf from a reputed supplier like Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, or one of the other big players, less likely to be an issue of concern, probably a better way of reducing risk, although it raises other types of risks in dealing with IBM or one of these other companies from the perspective of being able to establish a good working relationship and being able to define the terms of the agreement. Financial management systems, human resource management system, IT services, and so on. Integration is really the key issue here. It can be a source of complexity and difficulty, but on the other hand, some of these large firms have got a lot of experience in working with integrated applications over different organizations, and as such would probably be in a position to help limit and reduce risk associated with the implementations of these projects, and therefore could be likely candidates for a PPP type of funding arrangement. The next slide looks at some of the current best practices and trends that have an influence in procurement and ICT project design. Generally speaking, today, and especially in the USA and in other jurisdictions, this information actually has been taken from recent work done by CIOs, that's Chief Information Officers of the states of state enterprises in the United States, who have been looking at trying to identify best practices to help them better manage ICT rollout and service delivery. They have concluded on the following best practices and trends. There's a need to have in place well-developed enterprise technology plans. So technical officers, invariably chief information officers working in ministries or governments, need to establish and put in place technology or enterprise technology plans, which basically lists what they're trying to do, how they're trying to do it, and what technology. They need to have and develop an enterprise view and a good governance model. The governance model is a shared decision-making model that involves the possibility of various stakeholders to participate and to add their contributions to the decision-making process. There's a concern about accountability and measuring value and performance. So when you develop a project proposal for your ministry, you need to be able to quantify the outputs, the outcomes you are seeking, and to develop indicators so you can measure value, quantify that value, and track it over time so that you can come up with a measure of performance against original objectives and outputs or outcomes. There's a greater tendency to look at consolidation of services and to the adoption of shared services. This makes sense. It's an efficient way of spending money and of sharing money. Now, the challenge, of course, for CIOs in given ministries will be to encourage collaboration beyond their ministries in order to achieve these economies of scale and the benefits of consolidation and shared services. Need to strengthen certain business disciplines within the ministries and within the Office of the Chief Information Officer, specifically related to project management, because many of these enterprise technology plans and so on are really a factor of project management. To be able to implement customer relationship management, because now with the greater emphasis on the public as client, there's a need to be able to track public perceptions and to measure reaction of the public to public service delivery that is, and in particular the sort of delivery of electronic services. So a whole host of web-based analytics may well be needed to support these well-developed enterprise technology plans and the emphasis on accountability and performance that is now the norm in this particular case in the United States of America when it comes to ICT best practices. What are some of the concerns or some of the issues that drive the uptake of PPPs in e-government? Well, again, focus on the delivery of services and not on the delivery of outputs that are measurable. High costs. It's getting expensive to implement. In some cases, it might be possible through an arrangement with the private sector to reduce costs and to actually shift costs to the end user and the consumer. This will be more likely in cases where the end user or the consumer is the private sector. For example, in customs, electronic customs services, or in e-procurement, and so on. In these cases, and we do have examples of this, the costs can be transferred directly to the private sector and to the end users themselves via the private sector. When it's very complex, then and there are technical challenges of PPP, and in particular partnership with the private sector may be the best solution. When it's difficult to implement IT projects, working with a partner that has a track record in project implementation has its advantages. When you can more readily meet customer and public expectations through the use of a PPP type of model. Some projects have very high visibility, and increased success by working in a PPP model, by bringing in private sector expertise, may well be a reason for working with the private sector in order to ensure that they're successful and that these highly visible projects are achieved on target and on specification. Decreasing budgets, obviously. More demands for accountability and transparency. It may well be that structuring a PPP is a good way of increasing accountability and transparency, as long as the contract is well defined and the outputs and risks are accounted for, measured, and valued. There may be issues related to security risks. In some cases, there's a concern that by involving the private sector, we increase the security risk by exposing data to the hands of the private sector. On the other hand, private sector has a better handle on security technology and practices and may well be able to provide greater security than would otherwise be available if the project was implemented strictly on an in-house basis in government. What is the relationship between development status and the use of PPPs in the government? Well, developed countries are leading in the take-up of PPPs along with some developed countries. Developed countries are leading, but several developing countries are catching up. These include India, South Africa, Brazil. India is very active in the use of PPPs, both at the national level and at the local and community level. PPPs are also used in many universal access projects, and multi-stakeholder PPPs are the model in those particular instances. Countries that are leading in terms of their capacity to deliver e-government focus on service delivery on the client and may well be more likely candidates to undertake a PPP simply because they are better able to manage their e-government processes in the first instance. Just because they're better managers does not mean they will not take advantage of what PPP has to offer as an investment vehicle, as an alternative financial mechanism. Business process efficiency through the use of ICTs is a way of better meeting the needs of clients, so that might be a consideration. In many developing countries, e-government is mostly for business process efficiency because the service mentality is a new idea. PPPs may be able to take advantage of this as an approach. And for e-government to succeed, you need to focus on the needs of the public and at the same time be open to the potential of extending the reach of e-government, of government service delivery by involving the private sector in the development of new models of e-government service delivery. Internationally, PPPs are used in many developed countries, mostly actually for large infrastructure projects, as I mentioned. E-government is a new idea and PPP is a new approach. So as a result, we don't have a full a depth of experience in using PPPs for e-government as we would have in using PPPs for large infrastructure projects in the areas of education, health, and government procurement, or government buildings, and so on in other sectors. But with modernization of government business processes through the use of ICTs, many business opportunities emerge. Governments can't do it all, and the private sector sees business opportunities, and so there are greater chances for public and private sector to come together and to work together in implementing enhancing service delivery through the public-private partnership model. The other point that can be made is that with the increasing sophistication of the private sector in developing and delivering cross-sectoral applications as well as standalone applications, the risks associated with application development and implementation under a PPP in the private or in the public sector are being reduced on an ongoing basis. So that is another reason for considering partnering with the private sector provider in order to enhance public service delivery through the PPP mechanism when it comes to using e-government as a vehicle for that service delivery. Many public-private partnerships start with informal exchanges and discussions between the government and the private sector, and that's where many governments need to start in order to look at the potential for using PPPs in ICT for D in general and in e-government delivery in particular. There's also a need to look at, there might be also an opportunity to do pilot projects in order to develop proof of concept before rolling out a e-government service application on the basis of a PPP. Doing it on a pilot project basis is probably a very good way of reducing risk. Here are some examples of PPPs that have been used in the e-government sector for e-government in different parts of the world. One example comes from the state of Virginia. This is a highly complex PPP, as it turns out. It was developed by a private sector firm, a software developer, that proposed to the tax services that it could enhance not only the collection of taxes, but increase the collection to a particular level of service. They defined, I think it was a 3 to 6% increase in the total amount of taxes recovered if the system that they are promoting was implemented. The company developed the system, tested it, and implemented it in collaboration with the Department of State, the tax service of the Department of the State of Virginia in the United States. And not only were the service levels in terms of increased volumes and amounts of money collected as a result, the project was done on specification and on time. The service provider, the private sector partner, funded absolutely everything in the contract, the software development, the testing, and so on. And the contract was written such that the private sector provider would only be paid if the system was operating by a given date and if the revenues exceeded a certain pre-agreed amount by 3 or 6%. I can't remember the exact amount. Those conditions were achieved, and the operator was either paid directly or, I believe, received a certain percentage of tax filings on an ongoing basis for a given period of time in order to recoup the original investment and to secure a profit. It was a highly beneficial project to both partners, although it was a highly risky project from the outset. It is largely because of the skills and capacity of the private sector partner that the project was successful in reaching its objectives. Whether it can be replicated elsewhere depends in large part on the capacity of the private sector partner, both in terms of its technical capacity and its project management skills. In Singapore, the National Broadband Network was run as a PPP. In the UK and Scotland, the health services sector, hospitals have been run as on a PPP basis, and the e-health component of those services have been developed and run on a PPP basis as well, and are consistent with the rest of the National Health Service electronic health service grid. In Canada and the Philippines, we've used procurement, electronic procurement. We'll be explaining that shortly. Corporate registration and corporate services in India have been run as a PPP. The Tata Corporation won that bid and has implemented it as a PPP in that country. Government one-stop service portals in many jurisdictions. These are online and voice-based service offerings. In Canada, they're known as Service Canada. It's a one-stop portal that users or consumers and citizens can go to in order to get information about government services in general. These are run as public-private partnerships initially and are based on a call center and a web portal. There are various and many local and community-based level delivery, public service delivery projects that are run on a PPP basis, especially in India. And we will talk about some of these. So what are some of the characteristics of using these PPPs in the e-government sector? Various models are appropriate. These models are based on the concept of government that allow access to public information in exchange for a private sector operator establishing an access facility. What I mean here by access to information is that the concession that the government provides to the private sector partner is a concession to use for the exclusive use of certain types of information. It could be information about a particular public service that the private sector partner will make available through an online platform and at cost. The private sector partner is responsible for developing the platform and interacting with the public. The government provides an agreement to the private sector concessionaire that the information it's making available is only available to him or available under specific conditions to be used by that concessionaire to deliver a particular service at a given cost. In India, this model is used considerably. The private sector operator sometimes seeks the approval of government to access public information and then turns around and looks at what is the business case for selling this information to people who don't have it at this particular time, especially in the rural areas. One such service is the Bhumi Center that has been developed in collaboration with one company, Enlog, which is a private sector firm in India. They have set up centers with access to records, information on records of land ownership. They obtained the concession for government to access and to load this information onto their computers, and they've sold access to the records to small landowners for a particular price that has been pre-agreed between themselves and government, so that landowners themselves can more readily access their land ownership records, which are extremely important for collateral loan and for legal purposes, and the business model has been highly successful. Other characteristics of PPPs in e-government: the government may work with the private sector to establish an access facility or service. And again, in India, e-Seva centers are developed with the assistance of government. Contrary to the previous example, it's the government that takes the initiative here. They establish these centers where it is possible to access a variety of different online services. Certain payments can be made to government. You can access, you can get certificates and so on, and you can pay for these directly at these centers. Government enters into a relationship, contractual relationship with a private sector entrepreneur in a community, and an arrangement is made whereby the private sector entrepreneur sets up a computer-based facility that's connected to the internet with the assistance of government. On the other hand, government provides access to a concession to access certain government services that are made available through this center at the local level. The example of the online procurement system of Canada and Philippines, which we'll describe as a case study shortly, is another example of a government concession to information. In other examples, the private sector partner develops a solution and shares it when it's operational. The Virginia tax example we just spoke about is an example where a private sector partner actually sets up a project, a solution, and makes it available and shares in the revenues. Thirdly, once the access rights are provided to the government information, then the private sector operator will look at building an operational model around access channels or facilities that it puts into place at its own cost. So once it's determined that it can get this information and or provide these services, it gets the agreement to do so from government, then the private sector entrepreneur will look at what is the business model to deliver this, i.e. what is the number of potential users, what is the cost for us to set up and establish access online to this information, and what is therefore the cost at which we can resell the service to this market, and what is the potential for making money and a profit on this basis. That is the case study. That is an interesting example, and it's one that's been pursued by some companies in India in particular, whereby in underserved areas they propose to the public, to the government, to extend the reach of government services on the business model, and in some cases it does work, and it works quite well. But again, the government must agree to allow access to government service, government information that the private sector entrepreneur can then diffuse more readily to end users under conditions where the government usually is not able to reach those end users. Here are some PPP examples from various parts of the world. As I said, the e-Seva centers in Andhra Pradesh, which is a state in India, one of the states in India. These e-Seva centers were established by the government to deliver online payments, online services, including payments and delivery certificates. Each center has a counter with contract staff, so it's run as a little business. The government departments update the data when the transactions are received from these eSIVA counters. It's small-scale contract operators in different localities that are managing these, that are operating these, but it's still a PPP. There are different channels that can be used, including online and otherwise. As more public information and services are provided in this fashion, there's more information made available, there's more demand, more clients. It's a self-propagating prophecy, if you want. It's a very good business deal. And public services and information can be expanded beyond what was originally proposed, land titles and payments and delivery of certificates, to include a variety of other services as well. I mentioned the company NLOG based in India. This company seeks to develop markets for the provision of public information using their access facilities. They make money in delivering the access through their access facilities, access to this information. And this is an interesting business case that they've been testing and developing in many parts of rural India where government services are not readily available. So NLOG develops an e-government application as a business idea, develops the technology at its own cost, tests the technology and its delivery in rural areas, does market studies to see what the business case is, works with the local government in some cases and hospitals, in particular case of health service delivery, if that's the model that they're looking at, as well as the end users, the medical community, and so on. In this particular case, NLOG delivered medical and other services at kiosks in rural areas which were underserved by public health services and facilities. And they determined that there was a great demand for health services, but that getting access to health services required individuals to travel several kilometers to the local clinic or to the local or closest hospital and then line up to get an appointment or to see a doctor or a practitioner. This is very time-consuming and not very productive. So instead, what they've decided would be an interesting business case was to develop a portable digital health and blood circulation meter to look at doing exams digitally with a digital camera, and to look at developing technologies that could undertake non-intrusive blood tests. In other words, you don't puncture the skin and don't cause harm or blood to flow during your testing. And it was determined that many of these services are in great demand, and that there was a possibility of scheduling that demand in public hospitals, so that what the company could do was act as a go-between between the hospital and the patients who are interested in medical services, so that their kiosks would be locations where the public could come for these tests. The test results would be sent to the hospital, and on the basis of the test results, a further step would be taken as to diagnosis by the physician in question. In some cases, it might require the individual to actually go to the hospital, and the system would allow for the establishment of an appointment at a mutually agreeable time, and for the individual to then move to the hospital on their own steam. Another application is in the area of land titles. Land titles are extremely important. The e-Boomi system I just mentioned. Without land title or access to land title, you cannot establish legal title to land, and you cannot use your land for credit or as a for bank loans or for mortgages and so on. So the land title system has got 20 million records of land ownership that apply to 6.7 million farmers in the state of Karnataka. NLOG developed a business case, provide the wireless network access, developed the kiosk model, and charge for the service. The National Health Service in Scotland, this example actually relates mostly to an infrastructure project. This company, Atos Healthcare, won a PPP contract to establish a hospital. A component of the hospital involved a national patient register, an e-pharmacy, e-care, which is a secure information sharing platform between the health and social care professionals in the hospital and the National Healthcare Service. So it's possible to actually develop e-health applications, e-government applications in the PPP, and this was done as a part and parcel of a larger development where the Atos healthcare company secured a public-private partnership contract from the UK government to actually build and operate a hospital. They did this using their own funds, that is the funds they were able to secure from the financial marketplace, built the hospital and integrated these e-service facilities as part of an e-government e-health service that was implemented as a component of the overall project. So conclusions. There are many business cases that can be made for providing greater access to government information and services. But governments must be willing to see the advantages of enhanced service delivery before they can take advantage of these opportunities. The private sector must know the market for these services and be prepared to experiment. And pilot projects are always a good idea to evaluate business models and technical solutions. So the question really is, what are the best opportunities for your jurisdiction? And a lot of that will depend on whether or not the government and the private sector are talking together and are looking at opportunities for collaboration. And that's how we would like to conclude this particular section, and we'll move on to the next session now.